Hello and welcome to Gallagher's Public Sector Market Minute. Quick answers to common insurance questions. I'm your host, Shannon Gunderman, Executive Director with Gallagher's Public Sector and K-12 Education. Our guest today is Mike Kessler. Mike's an Area Vice President located in Dallas, Texas. And in this podcast, Mike is going to help us appreciate the nuances of flood insurance coverage. Thanks for joining us, Mike. First off, how would you define flood as it applies to insurance coverage, and why is it so important that we get that definition right?
Thank you, Shannon, for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here on this podcast today. And I'm very pleased to start with what I think is the first issue in any risk management program, and that's flood. Flood is a problem just due to the massive number of claims in the U.S. every year. FEMA has a very large definition of flood, which is very technical because it has to cover the several 100,000 policies they're about to pay. Over the last 30 years, I've crafted a much shorter definition, which is water on the ground rising from the bottom up to properties. So imagine that you have a backhoe hit a large water main right in the middle of the street. The water shoots way up 40 feet in the air, falls back to the ground, and then rolls into your city, county, or school district building. So in that case, we have water on the ground, two properties, and flood is not traditionally covered by any other policies other than a flood policy. So it's something for which to have concern.
That's really a great definition, Mike. It really kind of takes a long FEMA definition and really makes it a little bit understandable and easy to understand and digest in that succinct form. So thank you for that. Now let's talk a little bit about flood zones. What exactly is a flood zone? How is it categorized? And do all property owners need to be concerned about the location of their buildings?
So FEMA determines flood zone. They determine flood zones through flood maps. Interestingly enough, in my opinion, every building is in a flood zone. There's simply positive flood zones and negative flood zones. Also, interestingly enough, the best flood zone, the one you want to be in, is called X. Why it's called X, I'll never know. All other named flood zones are literally negative. A, E, EA, AO, V, VE. Anything that is not X would be considered a negative flood zone. And it's a real problem because even FEMA in 2020 indicated that they're not sure about the total accuracy of their own flood maps. They are primarily concerned about rivers and coastlines, but we've had rain events that have occurred that put so much water on the ground, again, water on the ground rising from the bottom up, that creeks and streams and other low-lying areas have flooded really throughout the U.S., and you've seen it in the news quite recently.
You mentioned those rain events as well as coastal cities. I can't help but think about the recent natural disaster, Hurricane Ian, which has caused substantial damages to cities like Fort Myers in Florida. These particular catastrophic losses have made a lot of people, I think, in coastal cities become concerned, not only about their ability to obtain appropriate coverage, but then what does that appropriate coverage look like for their entity? So in addition to flood coverage, are there any other policies that should be considered by property owners, especially in coastal cities?
I divide property coverage really into three areas. The first is flood, which we're talking about on this podcast. The second is wind. And the third would be all other perils. AOP is how it might appear in insurance writings. AOP, all other perils, would include fire, water, smoke, explosion, theft, malicious mischief, a number of other items. So if you're in an area where there are few natural disasters, you might be able to buy a property policy that includes flood plus wind plus all other perils. If you're in a coastal area, you probably are going to need to buy three different policies: flood, wind, all other perils. I think the big example was Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston. In Hurricane Harvey, over 200,000 buildings flooded. In that particular case, only 60,000 of them had flood coverage. So it's something that a lot of people miss, and we'll talk in a minute why missing flood exposure could be a real problem for you as a risk manager.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that, Mike. So typically, you and I both know, having experience in the insurance industry, myself as a risk managers are typically the ones responsible for making sure exposures are covered and appropriate insurance is purchased. So when a risk manager is advised by their organization that it has purchased a new property or maybe is renting a new property, what immediate steps should that risk manager take?
As we discussed earlier, I always start with flood. You can actually go look at the location of your city, county, or school district, or you can visit it via Google. Is it near a body of water, a creek, downhill from other buildings, whatever. One of your least favorite days ever as a risk manager might be that day when you hear that building number 13 flooded. There's water on the ground rising from the bottom up, and we have damage to our building and or our contents. So then you call your agent or your consultant to determine if you have a flood policy. If you don't, you have to call back and determine how large that damage might be. And then you'll have to report upstream to, no pun intended, to your own entity and talk to your manager and other executives to say, okay, we had flood, water on the ground rising from the bottom up, but we didn't have a flood policy. So we're going to be uninsured for this particular exposure and loss. So in my job, I refer to each of my clients as having two parts. There's the entity itself. I try to protect the entity, the city, the county, or the school district. And then the other part is to protect the risk manager. So I make recommendations to the risk managers. I recommend that they make risk management recommendations upstream to the other executives so everybody's aware of what they're covering and what they're not covering. For example, have you built a new building? If so, did you review it for flood? Have you leased a new building? Did you put contents in there? If so, have you reviewed it for flood? Or are you purchasing a new building and what's the expectation of flood there? To miss flood is a real problem, and unfortunately it happens every year.
Some great recommendations and advice, Mike. Thank you so much. And thanks for taking the time to explain things related to flood insurance with us today. Thank you all for joining today's podcast. If you have any questions about today's content or you'd like to have assistance in reviewing your own property insurance program, please feel free to contact Mike using the information on your screen.